The radio broadcast is underwritten by Cascade Audi. Today's program is generously sponsored by the Knight Foundation and the University of Akron. Additionally, we'd like to recognize the Akron Beacon Journal and Ohio.com for being a legacy sponsor. Please mark your calendar now for our next roundtable scheduled on Thursday, February 19th, when the Akron Roundtable will host a biomimicry panel who will discuss biomimicry in Northeast Ohio, creating conditions for place-based innovation inspired by nature. To make a reservation for any of the Akron Roundtable luncheons or to purchase a subscription to our luncheon series, please visit our website at akronroundtable.org. We also invite you to join our group on Facebook. Today, the Akron Roundtable is pleased to have with us Stephen Johnson, and we are very pleased he's with us. He came from New York, and as you're all aware, there was some activity in New York. Stephen will present on the topic, How We Got to Now, Lessons from History's Unsung Innovators. I will now ask Dr. Scott Scarborough, University of Akron's president, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Akron Roundtable and the Knight Foundation, I'm delighted to be able to introduce a media theorist, practitioner, and best-selling author who was chosen by Prospect Magazine as one of the top 10 brains of the digital future. His writings have influenced everything from cutting-edge ideas in urban planning to the battle against 21st century terrorism. Stephen Johnson has written 9 books, including Future Perfect, Everything Bad is Good for You, Where Good Ideas Come From. He is the founder of several influential websites and co-creator of the PBS series How We Got to Now with Stephen Johnson. As the host of a 6-part series, he explored the power and the legacy of great ideas, why and how ideas happen, and their sometimes unintended results. Building on How We Got to Now, Stephen created How We Get to Next, supported by the Knight Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That web-based project collects and develops news and ideas about the surprising people and places that are inventing an amazing future for us. Stephen is a contributing editor to Wired Magazine, has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Nation, and many other periodicals. He's appeared on many high-profile television programs, including The Charlie Rose Show, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and The NewsHour with Jim Laird. And today we are glad to host him on the University of Akron campus for this Akron Roundtable Extra. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Johnson.
Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be out of New York City. I got to the airport yesterday, bumped up my flight, and I think I was on the last flight out of Newark. But my goal was to take whatever flight was leaving Newark, and I would just get somewhere that wasn't New York City, and I figured out a way to get here. But fortunately, it all worked out. Honored to be here. Thanks to the Roundtable and the Knight Foundation, which we've collaborated with over the years. I think this is a fitting topic, How We Got to Now, both the show and the book, for the spirit of this organization and this community. It's really a show and a book about the power of human creativity, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the progress that comes from innovation. And I wanted to walk you through a few stories from this project and actually from an earlier book or two of mine, and talk about what this really means and understanding how innovation works in society. One of the things that we wanted to do with the show is to demonstrate, in a way, how unpredictable innovation is. Someone comes up with an idea in one field that solves a particular problem in one place, and it ends up triggering a set of changes that ripple through society in ways that are very hard to predict in advance. And the other thing we wanted to do is to celebrate and to try and understand where innovation comes from. What can we do in society, in ourselves, in our communities, in our organizations, to encourage and foster this kind of thinking. So what I thought I would do with our time, and we've got some time for some questions that are going to come in the form of cards on the table, that Elizabeth is going to read to me. She's going to filter them, so don't try and get anything past her. But I would start with telling you a few stories, and I'm going to start actually going back a long way, almost 1,000 years, to a story about a community that left Constantinople after the fall of Constantinople and traveled to Venice and arrived in Venice in the early 13th century. And they arrived with a very particular skill. In a way, they were some of the most advanced technologists of the age. They were glassmakers. They had achieved a level of skill in manipulating glass and making it into these kind of elemental shapes, and making it relatively transparent, not by our standards, but by the standards of the time. And this was a very advanced art. It was one of the most advanced technologies in the world at that particular point. So they arrived in Venice, and the kind of the elders of Venice were very excited about this. This was a new industry that had arrived as new kind of intellectual expertise that was suddenly available to the city. And so they were very encouraging about this business that had arrived. But there was a problem, which is that to manipulate glass, to make glass, you have to have temperatures of over 1,000 degrees, right? You have to have these furnaces that can kind of melt silicon dioxide at over 1,000 degrees. And Venice at that point was a city made entirely out of wooden buildings. So they brought in these furnaces, and while they were making these beautiful products, they had this unfortunate side effect of burning the neighborhood down, which was frowned upon at the time. And so the Venice elite decided on this kind of compromise, which is they wanted to keep the glass makers, glass blowers, but they didn't want to burn down Venice. And so they sent them across the marshland to the Isle of Murano, where you can still visit them today. It's a famous kind of tourist destination, the island of glass. And they set them up there, and what it created, interestingly, was what we would now call an innovation hub. By concentrating all these glass makers in a very small physical space, it created this environment where ideas were able to kind of circulate much more quickly. And while the different families, had their own businesses and they were kind of competing with each other on some level, there was also a tremendous amount of collaboration in this kind of dense network of glass makers. And within a short amount of time, they pioneered a number of techniques. The invention of crystal glass, the clearest glass the world had ever seen, came out of Venice. It became a huge economic driver. In fact, it was so important to Venice that after another 50 years of this, they forbade the glassmakers from ever leaving Murano with their skills and expertise under the threat of the death penalty for leaving. This is a strategy I'm not sure if I'd recommend for Akron, encouraging innovation, but it worked during this period. And so this was the start of something. It started basically influencing society in a surprising way. When we think about glass, we don't really think of it as advanced technology. You look at your glasses you're drinking your iced tea out of, and you think of windows, and it all seems kind of prosaic. But in fact, glass arguably is the single most important material to the last 1,000 years of human history. And one of the first things that happened in that history after the glassmakers arrived in Venice is an innovation that seems to be unrelated to glass, which is the original invention of the printing press. So Gutenberg invents a printing press about 100 years later, after the glassmakers have settled in Murano. And we all know Gutenberg. This is the movable type. This is maybe the most important communications revolution of all time. And most of us have a theory of what happened with Gutenberg. Books got into circulation, literacy rates rose, religious revolutions, scientific revolutions, artistic revolutions came out of the circulation of printed matter for the first time. But there's another part of the story of Gutenberg which we never hear about, which is that all across Europe, after people started to read for the first time in large numbers, this kind of mass literacy starts to become something that we talk about for the first time. All across Europe, a certain subset of the audience of new readers has the same reaction, which is they look down at these new books and they say, I can't read that. I am farsighted. I can't make out these words. I would like to read, but I can't. And actually, this was a problem that had been latent in the human population forever. People had always been farsighted, they just didn't notice it. because there really wasn't any occasion, unless you were, say, a seamstress or something, to look at small, little detailed letters or something equivalent to letters close to your eyes. And so people were walking around, farsighted without having any reason to worry about this or having it be a problem. And it was the invention of the book and the circulation of books that suddenly exposed this flaw in the eyesight of Europeans. And that sent out a kind of a market signal across Europe that if you could make these lenses and build these spectacles, which were originally pioneered by monks in the 11th and 12th centuries, the only people who were reading before Gutenberg. Suddenly all these lens makers start to flourish around Europe. They start to make money by making glasses for people because there's this new need that's been created because of the book. And because of that kind of wave of expertise in manipulating glass and making lenses, people start to experiment with those lenses and tinker with them the way people tend to, fueled purely by curiosity and kind of playfulness. And after a while, people say, hey, if I can take two of these lenses, instead of putting them side by side, what if I put them like this? And actually, I can see very distant objects as if they're close. The telescope is invented. And almost immediately, the telescope triggers a revolution in science. Galileo gets a hold of one of the very first telescopes, modifies it, and sees the moons of Jupiter for the first time, and basically sets in motion a revolution in our understanding of our place in the universe. And of course, the other direction happens as well, and the microscope is invented. And that actually takes a little bit longer for it to trigger a real revolution in science, about 70 years or so, until Robert Hooke starts doing these extraordinary analyses of objects. He puts all these things under microscopes and draws them, these beautiful drawings. In a famous book that he did from a period, this is his drawing of a flea. And one of the things he does is he puts a little tissue of cork under the microscope, and he draws that, and in observing it and describing it, he notices that there are all these little boxes in the cork, and he calls those things cells. And it's the first time anyone had observed and named the cellular basis of our bodies, and plants, and the world of life. So think of all those innovations. Think of how much in science and in medicine and health that has come from our ability to see the very small, to see the very large. And the other thing that happens with glass right around this period is that also back in Venice, people for the first time start to make high-quality mirrors that actually reflected in an accurate way that, what someone looked like. Until around the 14th and 15th centuries, it was almost impossible for ordinary human beings to have any idea what they looked like. It was simply not something you could see. There weren't clear mirrors, there weren't accurate mirrors, they were discolored, they were distorted. You would occasionally get a glimpse of yourself in a kind of a pool of water reflected. But basically, knowing what you looked like was something that is a creation of the mirror. And almost immediately, artists begin to use the mirror as a tool for art. They use it actually to invent perspective and painting, but they also obsessively begin to do all these paintings of themselves. Rembrandt painted 40 or 50 paintings of himself over his life. There's just an endless number of Renaissance, great works of Renaissance art that involve self-portrait. Self-portraiture as an art form really didn't exist until the invention of the mirror. The mirror set it in motion. So because of this revolution in glass, these Renaissance masters invented the selfie, which is really kind of amazing when you think about it. And we joke about selfies, but what's interesting about it is that as soon as the technology emerged, thanks to glass, to be able to capture an accurate representation of what your face looked like, the artists who had the ability to do this immediately began compulsively taking selfies. They were using oil paints instead of the iPhone, but they were just as interested in it as your average teenager is today. So it's a deep tradition. Next time you post that selfie on Instagram, remember you're in the legacy of Rembrandt. So you can see right there, think of all those changes just up until that point, and it continues on. I mean, today you take that selfie, you take it with a glass lens on your camera, look at it on a glass screen. The information in that selfie is traveling through glass-based fiber optic networks, right? Fiber optics is, the fibers in fiber optics is made of glass fibers. So even today, we're completely dependent on this extraordinary material, and we don't ever think about it, right? We don't ever think about the layers of human ingenuity that made all these technologies possible, that helped us understand what we could do with glass and how we could push it in all these surprising directions. So that's part of the vision of innovation that I want to start with is that it is a very unpredictable journey. And when you invent one thing, it almost always triggers effects in other fields. That's part of the excitement of it, but that's also part of the challenge of it, is managing it, trying to understand where it's going to take us. The other thing that's, I think, important when we look back at the history of innovation is we tend to tell these, I think, inaccurate stories about eureka moments and light bulb moments. People always love to hear the story about this sudden inspiration where somebody had this brilliant idea in a flash. But that's almost never the way it works in practice. When you go back and look at the history of innovation, ideas that are truly transformative almost always take a long time to develop. They're what I call the slow hunch. They start with this feeling of possibility, and they often stay in that state, even though you can't quite explain what's so interesting about the idea. They stay in that state for months, sometimes for years, sometimes for a decade or more, before they turn into something truly powerful. Really big ideas are hard. They don't come to you in a moment of inspiration. They often take, patience. And so when we seek out, as a society or as individuals, those moments of sudden clarity, I think we're making a mistake. We should be looking and cultivating the slow hunches. And there's a great example of that embodied in this slide. I don't know if you can see this little sticker, and the handwriting says, "This machine is a server. Do not power it down." And the giveaway of what this is that it says CERN up there in the upper left-hand corner. That is the Swiss physics lab where Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. More than 20 years ago, this little sticker was on the original World Wide Web server back when the entire web was running on one machine. So you could literally trip over the power cord and take the entire web down. That's what it was like. You go, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You should totally plug that back in. I feel really bad. So Berners-Lee starts working on this project in 1982 as a young programmer. And he did it initially just as a hobby, as a side project for himself. He shows up at CERN, he's overwhelmed with all the amazing people there, and he thinks, gosh, I should create a little application that would help me keep track of everyone, and all the papers that are being published, and amazing connections and ideas that are flowing around this space. So he builds this little program, he calls it Inquire, and he uses it for a couple of years, and then he puts it aside, and then he picks it up again in the mid-'80s, and he works on it a little bit more, and then he puts it aside. And it's not until 5 years after he first arrived at CERN that he begins to work on an iteration that he comes to call the World Wide Web, building on the existing infrastructure of the internet, putting this kind of layer of hypertext over the existing internet architecture. And all this leads to one of the great office conversations in history, in my opinion, where Berners-Lee goes into his superiors and sits down and says, listen, I think I may have invented a global communications medium in my spare time. Can this be my day job now? Instead of that stupid stuff you got me doing, I'd like to focus on this. And unfortunately they said yes, and the rest is history, right? But think about that, those 5 years, and in a way, the funny thing about this is, it took 5 years for the idea to really mature in Berners-Lee's mind. It took the world probably, at least 10 years, maybe 14 or 15 years to kind of catch up to the idea. The world wasn't ready for the World Wide Web in 1982. There just simply weren't enough personal computers out there, much less networked, connected personal computers. And so that's one of the reasons why the idea wasn't quite fully realized in Berners-Lee's mind. He was so ahead of the curve that he couldn't fully imagine it in 1982. So oftentimes, one of the things that happens with innovation is that the idea in your own mind or the mind of the people you're collaborating with needs this time, and then the world needs time to catch up. So you're dealing with kind of different time scales. But the other thing that often happens when you're working at the very edge of a field, when you're coming up with genuinely new ideas, is that you are uniquely vulnerable to blind spots in what you're working on. Precisely because you are being so adventurous, precisely because you're trying to really break the mold and do something new, there are sometimes these things that with hindsight seem glaringly obvious, but at the time you just couldn't see because you were trying to think new thoughts. And we rarely talk about this in the history of innovation. The history of innovation tends to be written by and about the victors, right? The great heroes who came up with the idea and succeeded, the Graham Bells and the Edisons and the Steve Jobses and so on. But I think it's just as important to focus on these places where people missed something, where they were genuinely thinking important new thoughts, but they failed to see something because, first off, the history is littered with these stories, and we might as well tell accurate stories, but also because we are all ourselves, however smart we may be, suffering from similar missing pieces and blind spots in our own attempts to be creative. And so we should learn from people's mistakes in the past. And maybe my favorite one is one of my favorite stories. It's a little tragic from the book and the show, but it's a story about a French inventor in the middle of the 19th century, a great French name, Edward Léon Scott de Martinville. And he invented in the early 1850s the first device ever that was capable of recording audio. It was called the phonograph. He got a patent for it in 1855. He had a working version before that, and it would capture sound waves coming in through the kind of upper left of that image there, through that kind of tube, which was made of this parchment that would vibrate. And the vibrations would be sent down to this little pig's bristle, which would then etch out the vibrations on that rotating wax cylinder, and then you could unfurl a piece of paper and see the waveforms, the sound waves written onto the page for the first time in history. It was called the phonograph, incredible invention. Now, what you're thinking is, wait, recorded audio, that's Edison. The phonograph, that's 25 years later, 1877. He's the guy who invented, recorded audio for the first time. So, what's the deal with this French guy? I've never heard of this guy. And the reason you haven't heard of him is because he omitted one key feature: playback. There was no way to listen to the audio that you recorded with this device. This turns out to be a feature that audiophiles really value in their audio products. There's a reason they put the headphone jack in the iPod, right? Just knowing that you had 1,000 songs in your pocket wasn't enough. You wanted to be able to hear them, right? And what I think is so important about this story is it's not that he wanted to have this feature but couldn't figure out how to do it. It never occurred to him. He couldn't see it at all as a possibility. It was completely in his blind spot. So here's a guy who was 25 years ahead of Thomas Edison. And yet he's unable, so he's doing all this amazing cutting edge work, but he's unable to see this basic thing. And it raises the question, if he wasn't trying to put playback on this device, what was he thinking, right? Why would anybody want this thing? And the answer is that he actually thought he had a very interesting idea. He was obsessed with stenography and shorthand. And he thought that if he could, in a sense, create a device that would automate that process, and so someone would speak and would write these sound waves onto this piece of paper, people would learn how to read this language in sound waves, and you would basically have an automated shorthand system, which was actually a pretty good bet. People have been reading scribbles on a page since the invention of the alphabet. It just turns out that unfortunately the human kind of cognitive toolkit doesn't allow us to read sound waves. No one to this day can read sound waves. So it was a wrong bet, but it was actually a pretty logical one. The funny thing is, the sad thing is, he died more or less penniless and forgotten to history. But just a couple of years ago, a group of scientists found, kind of audio historians found these original recordings that he had made in the early 1850s. They found them in the archives in Paris, and they put them into a computer. They digitized them. And the computer played back the audio, and initially they thought they were hearing a little girl singing, but then they realized they were playing it back at twice the speed, and they slowed it down, and it was Scott's voice from the grave singing Au clair de la lune. 150 years later, he finally got playback on his device. It was very, very haunting. I've heard the recording. It sounds a little bit like a horror movie soundtrack. It's very spooky sounding. It's not the highest quality, but it's an extraordinary thing. One of the ways around blind spots, though, that I think is really important, it's very hard to see these things so often, and one of the key ways to avoid this kind of problem is precisely to surround yourself with people who are different from you in some way, who have different perspectives, come from different fields of expertise. So often what happens is, you get locked into your project, you're seeing it entirely through, in the case of Scott, the metaphor of shorthand or stenography. And in part because he was working alone. He didn't really have that other voice that said, that's great, Edward, but it would be really great if we could also listen to it. You know, if he'd had a kind of musician or something like that who was working on the project with him, he might have been able to actually invent the phonograph 20 years before Edison, rather than have this invention that kind of died off. And there's a lot of research into this. This is not the kind of traditional kind of multicultural argument for diversity, although that's a very important one. It's not an argument about tolerance in society. It's an argument about making organizations, making teams, making communities smarter. There's a lot of research that shows that more diverse groups, more intellectually diverse groups, more ethnically, culturally, gender-wise diverse groups tend to be more creative in their problem solving, precisely because you have more perspectives brought to the table. There's a great study a number of years ago by a Stanford business professor named Martin Roif, who looked at, he was interested in the social networks of unusually creative people. And sadly for Roif, this was before the days of Facebook and Twitter, so he had to do all this research by hand, interviewing people, rather than now he could just scrape people's Twitter feeds. But he analyzed two groups. A group of people who had been unusually innovative in their careers, and then a group that had been slightly, to put it gently, less innovative in their careers. And he analyzed all their friend networks, and what he found was that there was this very distinctive pattern on the side of the innovators, which is that they were far more likely to have a much more diverse set of professions in their friend networks than the less innovative group. So it would be, you know, hanging out with your friend. You were in advertising, your friend's an architect. It seems on the surface like your fields are totally unrelated, just as, you know, Gutenberg and the glassmakers seemed unrelated. But there's something that your friend says about their architecture business and the way they deal with their clients that, you know, sparks an idea in some fresh perspective, and you bring it over across that disciplinary boundary, and it creates some new possibility in your own field. It's that movement across intellectual, experiential borders. That is so often what triggers new ideas and sets them in motion. And you can seek this out. Companies can seek this out kind of deliberately. Organizations can seek this out deliberately. There's a great story about Apple. When Apple was trying to invent their strategy for the Apple Store, the physical retail stores, which a lot of people mocked at the time when Apple announced that they were going to be doing stores and shopping malls and downtown areas. People were like, well, what does Apple know about retail? They don't know anything about it. This is going to be a disaster. The normal way you would do this is you would study people in your same field, right? You would say, okay, we're a consumer electronics store. We're going to make consumer electronics. Let's go study, I don't know, Best Buy or like Radio Shack or something like that. I mean, they've got Shack in their title right there. That's something weird. We should not call it the Apple Shack. That would be odd. But they wanted to do something different. They wanted to reinvent the experience of shopping for consumer electronics. And so instead of studying their direct competitors in the same field, they went and they studied 5-star hotels. And they sent a bunch of people to take the training program at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. And they came back and they said, so what's, you know, what do people do? Why do people love 5-star hotels so much? How can we learn from that in terms of our store? And they said, you know what people really like? They really like the concierge. Like you're at a 5-star hotel and you walk up to the concierge and you're like, I want to take a hot air balloon ride over Akron right now. And the concierge is like, okay, I'm on it. You know, that feeling is really great. And so they said, well, what would be the equivalent of a high-end hotel concierge in a consumer electronics store? And that, of course, became the Genius Bar, right? The Genius Bar is a port of an idea from hotels brought over into a new domain, reimagined in this new context. And you know where this ended up, right? This is the most profitable by square foot retail environment on the planet today, right? And the Genius Bar is so popular that you have to get a reservation like 3 months in advance. So there's, you know, kind of sometimes destructive success as well. But it was by reaching out and looking for inspiration in a surprising space. That's where Apple was able to come up with that idea. And this is, I know we have some high school students and college students here. This is the great opportunity that you all have at this point in your lives, is the ability to kind of jump from discipline to discipline. And the freedom, you know, the rest of your life after you leave school, everybody's going to be trying to specialize you and make you focused on one thing and to get good at one thing. But some of the smartest people, some of the most creative people got that way by having an eclectic set of interests and having hobbies, right? Not just being focused on one thing, but trying to make connections between all these different regions of your life. And what drives all of this, in a way in the end, and then we can open it up for questions, is the power of curiosity about the world. Focus is great, and focus is important, and you can't you can't just be kind of scatterbrained about things, but being open to curiosity about the world and following threads of interest, not knowing fully where they're going to take you, that is so often what separates people who are truly creative and innovative, and companies that are truly creative and innovative, from folks and organizations who are not. There's one story that, all the people in How We Got to Now are, on some level, just freakishly curious about the world, and it's a great property. But one of my favorites involves this guy, Clarence Birdseye. We have an episode about the history of coal, about the history of refrigeration and air conditioning, and how much that has changed the world. And Clarence Birdseye, some of you may recognize by Birdseye, frozen foods. He's the guy who, made the world safe for frozen TV dinners and peas and things like that. But his story is very interesting. He started off, he had this kind of strange career. He was a big naturalist. And he would travel around the kind of wilderness of the American West, and he had a fondness for eating pretty much everything. He had these journals where he would describe, I ate rattlesnake last night, I ate skunk, he was just doing incredibly disgusting things, eating everything he could find. And then for some reason, he got sent off to Labrador with like a 1-year-old baby in the winter in 1913, which was a very extreme environment, particularly to have a one-year-old baby. And he found himself just really desperate to get food for his family, and so there was basically, he was living off of like moose jerky. Everything was really, there was no fresh food, there were no obviously fresh vegetables and so on. The only thing they could do is they could go ice fishing. And so one day he goes out with a local Inuit ice fisher, kind of jumping across the cultural divide here, and learns how to ice fish. And it's so cold that when they pull this fish out of the frozen lake, it almost immediately freezes. And they take it back, and a few days later they thaw it out and they cook it for dinner, and it's the best tasting frozen food he's ever had. Every other frozen meal he's ever had has tasted terrible. And so he's like, what is going on? That is really interesting. That meal was really tasty. Now, most of us at this point would say, well, that was a good dinner, now I'm going to go to bed, right? But Birdseye, because of this curiosity that he had about the world, was like, wait, well, why was it so tasty? What was the deal with that? I gotta understand that. And so he conducts a series of experiments, some of which we recreated for the show. That's me. I went ice fishing. I would be the world's worst ice fisher. I would perish, as would my family, if I were in charge of ice fishing. But he conducted all these experiments, freezing things at different temperatures and thus at different speeds. Things froze very cold, freeze very quickly. And he discovered that if you freeze something at very low temperatures very quickly, it does less cellular damage to the food and thus makes it tastier when we eat it. And even then, that idea kind of stayed in his mind for another 8 or 9 years, talking about a slow hunch, until he figured out a way to industrialize that process. And he basically invents the flash freezing process that now then became part of General Foods. He made $100 million, and he's on these frozen peas to this day. Now, it's a great example of the power of curiosity, and it may seem like a little bit of a trivial thing. Frozen foods are nice, it's fine, but not the greatest invention in the world. But the same technology of flash freezing is used in most methods of IVF. Every time we freeze human embryos, eggs, sperm, we're doing it with that same fundamental method of flash freezing. So there are literally millions of people alive today who would not be alive were it not for this technology, our ability to manipulate cold. So you never know where these things are going to take you, but the one thing you can do is follow those interests, keep those slow hunches alive, make those diverse connections, and trust in the power of curiosity to take you to interesting places. Chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much.
Speaking of curiosity, as previously noted, our speaker has graciously agreed to respond to written questions. You'll find note cards at your table. Please write down your question and raise your hand. And Elizabeth Bartz, a member of our programming committee and also a board member of the Akron Roundtable, will present your question.
Don't worry, David Hunter's still around. He just wasn't able to be here today, so I hope I can fill his shoes. I will tell you, not very well, because I spent all morning. David comes up, he always has questions ready. I spent all morning watching PBS, reading Stephen's Twitter page and his website to make sure. I did find out we both know Jerry Mikulski, so this is great. They're collecting questions now, but I did want to ask, was there an invention which did not make the list of clean time, glass, which I thought of with mine, light, cold, and sound?
There's 6 episodes. Each one is focused on this kind of field, cold, glass, time, so on. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the best 6 would be, because we wanted them to be both surprising. We didn't want them to feel like normal innovations. We didn't do an episode on the smartphone or something like that. We wanted them to be things where, I never really thought about accurate timekeeping as a crucial breakthrough, but look how much has changed because of our ability to measure time accurately. And we wanted to make sure that each one had these kind of surprising leaps. That's part of the fun of the show and the book, is that you get taken to all these different places because of these kind of unanticipated consequences. So we looked at a bunch of them, and there are many that we could do an episode on, and I'm hoping that we're going to do more episodes. Actually, we're working right now on the season 2, which I think is pretty likely. So check your local listings. But one of the things I'm really interested in is play and the importance of play in the history of innovation. An amazing number of things come out of seemingly kind of trivial pursuits. And so I was just researching this one chapter about the history of games, sports, gambling, all that kind of stuff. And one of the great stories about it is that when Columbus comes to comes to the Americas for the second trip, and he's in Haiti, and there are these natives there that are playing this ball game, and they're kind of bouncing this ball around, and all of Columbus and his men are amazed because the ball is incredibly bouncy. And they're like, what is up with that ball? It is so bouncy. We have balls back in Europe. We've had balls for thousands of years, but we've never seen a ball bounce like that. And of course, it was the first rubber that Europeans had ever seen. They've been building using native plants. They've been making these rubber balls. And so for thousands of years in kind of Central America, there were these rubber ball-based games. It was this early kind of material science of figuring out how to get rubber, how to get it. It was a proto-vulcanization kind of technique. And the kind of idea of using rubber and the magic of this technique spread into Europe through ball games, basically. And it was another 300 years before Goodyear and tires and people started to think about rubber in more industrial uses. But the way that idea spread was by looking at this crazy bouncing ball.
I thought the answer was illusion. I was like, great. Okay. What is your advice to a community striving to nurture innovation and creativity?
Well, when you think about communities, one of the things that I think is really exciting, I was just at an event for a space like this in New York, is thinking about places where the community gets together, where you can have these unusual kind of collisions between different points of view. Historically, and I've written a lot about this, that space was the coffee house, right? This was the big driver of innovation in the 18th century. People would get together in these coffee houses in London and Paris, and they would have these interesting conversations, and a huge number of breakthrough ideas in science and business and politics come out of this semi-public space that's unstructured and a place where interesting ideas can kind of connect. Now we have more and more coffee houses, obviously, because of Starbucks and so on, but everyone's just on their headphones and on their laptops, and so you have less of that kind of interaction. So creating physical spaces where interesting kind of comminglings can happen is really important. And the movement that's really interesting in this is the co-working space movement, right? Creating these downtown areas where there's an office that's shared by a bunch of freelancers, a couple of startups, a couple of people working for big companies that are located somewhere else, people between jobs, and they share the Wi-Fi, and they share some coffee, and they share, a meeting space. And sometimes these spaces are actually kind of curated, and they have artists and residents who are there working on a painting or working on their novel. And it creates a space where people come in, but by definition, they're all working on different projects. So it's not one single organization, it's not one single university department. It creates a much more eclectic space, and that's a great way to kind of jumpstart that entrepreneurial innovation spirit.
We have a number of questions and really just a few more minutes. I just passed one up here. In the era of collaboration, is solitude still as important for innovation?
Yeah, I'm really glad someone asked that. I tend to spend a lot of my time talking about the importance of connectivity and the importance of networks, but I think what you want to have is a balance. The worst thing in the way is the kind of middle ground between the two, and that is the kind of intra-departmental meeting. That is the way to kill innovation. When everybody's working on, they all know each other. They're in the same division, the school or the office, working on the same problems, and they've got an hour and a half booked in a conference room somewhere, and someone's running a PowerPoint deck. That is not how to encourage innovation, right? The meeting where you're bringing in people from different parts of the organization, when it's less structured, where there's time to kind of not necessarily even brainstorm, but just to have conversation creating expertise, or even better, where you're meeting people like the Apple folks who went to study the Ritz-Carlton training program, who work in different fields. Those kinds of meetings can be really productive. But solitude is the other side of this, and I spend a huge amount of my time. I always try and carve out time at the end of the day, to sit and like listen to music without any email in front of me, without Twitter in front of me, without a laptop in front of me. And to just kind of think for, it's 20 minutes, 30 minutes, other people meditate, other people go for long walks. And there's an argument for that. People always ask me when I was first started talking about this, they'd be like, why do I have all my best ideas in the shower? And one of the reasons is there are very few places in modern life now where you can sit or stand for 5, 10, 15 minutes without any other stimuli. And it enables your brain to follow a train of thought to a surprising place. Right? When you're thinking in short blocks of 30 seconds, check email, 30 seconds, respond to this call, you don't have enough time to wander. And so the shower is one of those places, like a nice long walk or like sitting and listening to music, where your brain can get to an interesting new place. It allows you, in a sense, to network with your own ideas for longer. So that's if there is a takeaway, it's take longer showers. That's what I have.
There are a lot of questions here, and I will give them to you, and maybe you'll tweet about us. With the exception of Thomas Edison, because he's from Ohio, and there's nothing wrong with him. Is there a character flaw of many innovators that turn out to ultimately contribute to their success?
That's a terrific question. Yeah, a lot of it's interesting. I mean, there are probably like 15 people who were profiled in this book and show that I spent a bunch of time thinking about, and so I kind of feel close to them as a historian does to his or her subjects. But a number of them weren't particularly likable in a way. I mean, I kind of admire them, but they had, this is the thing people always said with Steve Jobs, that he was brilliant and incredibly charismatic and also a jerk. And the jerkishness was built into his success on some level. And there, in the book, there's a story about this guy, Frederick Tudor, who built the ice trade before artificial refrigeration came along. He basically made a fortune by taking large blocks of ice from frozen New England lakes and shipping them, keeping them cold and frozen, as far away as India or Rio, as well as all throughout the southern United States and so on. And he'd had this vision since he was about 19 years old, and he stuck with it through this incredibly long period of time. So he was incredibly, kind of dogged in his pursuit of this thing, but it meant that he was apparently, anyone who interfered with this vision, he could be kind of ruthless. And in fact, when people began to make artificial ice for the first time, inspired by the success of this natural ice business, he kind of launched a smear campaign saying that artificial ice was disease prone to transmit diseases and so on, as opposed to like frozen lake water. You're like, wow, there's a dead fish in my martini. So he was kind of ruthless, but it's clear if you read his story that on some level you can't you know, that perseverance and tenacity was, you know, made him kind of a jerk, but it also, he would have never, he went for a year. A shocking number of people also that we profile were at some point imprisoned for, for basically going bankrupt or defrauding their investors. Also not something I recommend to the good people of Akron, but you know, and Tudor is one of these people, so he wouldn't have made it through those kind of dark days if he hadn't been incredibly, you know, tenacious in his pursuit of this thing, but it made him also maybe a slightly less appealing person to have dinner with.
Mr. Johnson, thank you for being with us today. On behalf of the Akron Roundtable, it is my pleasure to present you with a contemplative sun as a memento of your visit with us this afternoon.
Hey, great, thank you.
This is a piece of Akron's innovation. It's a celebratory work of art that's designed exclusively for the Akron Roundtable by local artist and craftsman Don Drum. We invite the audience to join us at the Quaker Station in downtown Akron on Tuesday, February 19th, when the Akron Roundtable will host a biomimicry panel who will discuss biomimicry in Northeast Ohio, creating conditions for place-based innovation inspired by nature. Thank you all for being here with us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next roundtable.